Hey, welcome to Lab the Podcast. Grateful and excited to be here to share some time with artist Josh Nadeau. Josh is an artist, he's an author, husband, and father hailing from Canada's West Coast. He holds a Master's of Theological Studies and is founder of Sword and Pencil and Everyday Saints. Josh has also become a friend, and he's somebody that I admire greatly for his honesty, for your humility, Josh, and the pursuit of God and virtue in a really interesting moment in the world. So, Josh, thanks for making time to be with us. We're excited.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
How are you feeling, first of all? I know you went through a little bit of a bug. You got a book project, you got stuff, but we get the privilege of doing this from Tampa. So it's like warm and sunny and feels like we're
Oh,
kicked
yeah.
back and relaxed. How are you doing?
I mean, I'd be doing a lot better if I was in Tampa. Health is good. Like coming out of as everyone knows, out of a little flu season is always like, I get hit once a year. Actually, no, that's a bit of a lie. I haven't had a flu in a very long time. And so this one did not feel good. I was kind of like, I was joking with my wife. We have a 1-year-old and he got sick for the first time and he handled it better than I did. Like he was laughing, he was playing, and I was like walking around the house like holding my stomach. Um, yeah, but other than that, things are great. It's getting warmer here in Canada. We live in like this little pocket of better weather than everyone around us, but compared to Tampa, it would be a nightmare for you guys.
That's a way to say it. Here's my dream. If we're talking dreams and nightmares, there's a ton of people relocating and we will save a spot for you. It's that
Please
pretty. How
do.
about we just leave it? There you go.
I was so my wife and I are looking to move to the States, and the dream, if we're going to keep talking about dreams, is like part-time in the States and then part-time in Europe. Because both of us have spent significant amount of time in those locations, and we feel like those places are more home than where we currently are. And as far as the States is concerned, we're torn up between Florida and Tennessee. And I have friends in Tennessee, and I have you guys there in Florida, and some other friends in Florida. And I mean, it's just really hard to beat the salt air, warm weather. I mean, there's
Yeah.
crocodiles and stuff, but you can just dodge those.
Yeah. So far, the what everybody said when we moved, because I moved from Oregon, so we're Pacific Northwest,
Oh yeah.
born and raised, that west coast of the states. And we got here, and I was scared of hurricanes. I was scared of spiders and snakes and crocodiles. They said, "You don't have crocodiles, you got alligators." And but for the most part, everything you can see it coming, right? Like a hurricane, you've got a little bit of warning.
Totally.
Alligators, they're predictably in some places, randomly they'll show up in your pool, but other than that, you can predict where they're going to be. So you can avoid most catastrophe. Like on the West Coast, you may just get hit with an earthquake without any warning at
Yeah.
all. So
Or it
I
might just
guess,
be some forest fires,
yeah,
no
there you
warning.
go. There you go.
Yeah, you know what? I like that. There's
There you go.
another
Well,
thing
I'm
on my list crossed off. One step easier getting to Florida.
Point Florida. All right.
Yes.
Well, I have a feeling based on our desire to have a stateside presence and a presence in the UK that we could go that direction. We could talk about philosophy, theology. So I'm going to say we're going to
Totally.
agree to have a comma on this conversation and kind of
Yeah.
narrow the focus. And I was trying to figure out how do you do that? And I thought, first, tell us about just your work as founder, you're artist, theologian, husband, father, all those things, but
Mhm.
founder of Sword and Pencil and Everyday Saints. Before we dive in, just set some context for your work and what do you do? And then which of those came first? Did they parallel in origin story? But talk a little bit about the overall work on both sides.
Yeah, so Sword and Pencil started kind of just on a whim, maybe 5-ish years ago, 6 years, depending. I mean, time is one of those things, it goes by all the time. And so I had quit my job for various reasons. I was working at a big bank here in Canada. I was a project manager in technology, and it was just killing me. And so I quit, and I was doing bike courier work. And because bike courier work doesn't pay the same as bank work, my wife and I needed to downsize, and so we moved in with some friends. And while we were packing up um, our apartment, she found like a bunch of the doodles I had and drawn in the margins of seminary notebooks. And some of them were funny, some of them were not funny. And so she just suggested posting it online, and I did. And as with most things, I just cultivated that and kind of saw that aspects of it were resonating. And after a little while, I had to take a step back and say, okay, what do I want to do with this? I love art, I love communication, I love being able to build a community, but like this has become a little bit different than just like a jokey joke thing on the side. And so I had it's like a fortunate blessing of being able to take a moment and look at something you're doing and then ask yourself, why did you actually start it and what direction do you want to head with it? And so for me, the big thing just became, um, I think that real dialogue and conversation is a dying art in the modern world. And I think that the way the church has facilitated those kinds of conversations um, has generally been lacking in the sense of there seem to be topics that were off limit. There seem to be kinds of language that were off limit. There seem to be like entire mediums that were off limit. And so, like, I love podcasts. I'd use them all the time. And this conversation is of a different style, but like when I was growing up, most of it was just like, hey, the only way we do our faith and talk about our faith is like a one-sided sermonizing within these narrow bounds of what the approved catchphrases and slogans and proof that we're in the club. And so for me, I thought to myself, like, hey, I can use art as a way to get people's defenses down, to say something to them before they recognize I'm saying something to them. And then I can just write freely within a caption stuff going on in my life and what I'm working through and thinking. And then that just started to like really resonate with people. And so again, that was just like it was an ongoing cultivation. And so that was kind of like the impetus of when I started taking sword and pencil seriously. And the idea was just I want to have real and deep conversations, and art got to be the mechanism to allow those things to flourish.
Yeah. It's wild to hear you tell that story and to kind of live in the space that we're in and just recognizing like the resonance with your work right away was that beauty does open the door, and
Yeah.
there's a reality to it was good and pleasing. Like there's something that attracts us and does, as you said, disarm or open a window or open a door where you couldn't have a way in or a way forward. And I think that's why in our moment, and I'll just come out and say it, I think that you are one of a few really, really important artists in our moment. And I know you said earlier in a conversation, I'm a philosopher, maybe first philosophy theologian, and then maybe artist downstream of that. But your work as an artist, illuminated by those other parts of you, I think you and a few others are some of the most important and impactful artists of our moment. And I'll pull on that thread by saying this, like if you use Aquinas saying, what is beautiful? It's got harmony, it's got integrity, it's got clarity. If you use that as a measure of beauty, you would maybe say artist third to philosopher, theologian, artist. But here's what I mean. If we use Aquinas's measure of beauty was, does it have harmony? Does it have integrity? Does it have clarity? If you use that, or you use is art telling the truth. Francis Schaeffer said, theological excellence as well as artistic beauty. Any of those measures, your work is hitting like right to the center of it. But you're also able to communicate in our moment in a way. And I think that's what maybe your wife saw in your sketches that were coming out of your seminary days, of your ability to take these ideas and flesh them out in a way where they didn't lose any of their integrity or their significance, but they were translated into a language and into a form that was pleasing and drew people towards rather than push people away. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit about how you became artist, but underneath that, there's the philosophy layer and the theologian layer. Take us back
Hmm.
to kind of the origin story of faith and the development of your life of faith. Was that always a part of who you are, or did that develop kind of slowly over time?
Yeah, a bit of both. So thank you first off. Those are some very kind words. And as a Canadian, we're always a little bit self-deprecating and dismissive of compliments. So I do want to say thanks. Um, yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, and so we were in the church. Every time the doors were open, we darkened the doorstep. And so from a really young age, I mean, I was like catechized young. We like we were going through like Burkhoff systematic theology when I was a kid for family devotions. And so when I would go to Sunday school stuff, we're talking about Jesus feeds the 5,000 in Sunday school. And on the side, like I'm learning about the nature of the Father, and we're going through the Greek. And so it was like there was that whole catechesis thing. Um, but also in a very classic fashion, like it wasn't really my faith. It was just a thing grew up with, a thing I was taught. And so I fell away, had my own rebellious streak, played the part, did the hypocritical thing of put the best face forward on Sundays whenever the church doors are open, say just enough right answers so that no one pokes at you long enough and sees who you really are. Um, when I went away to university, I did my undergrad in physics, and I decided to take the first 2 years. The first year was just to say, like I knew that Paul said, if Jesus wasn't risen from the dead, eat, drink, be merry, tomorrow you die. And I was like, I love eating, I love drinking, I love being merry. And if there is no resurrection, then I can do these as freely as I want, or at least there's the excuse for the freedom I've been exercising with my eating and drinking and merrymaking. Um, and so I went deep. I just went into as much stuff as I could and then became pretty convinced of the resurrection. And so I took the next year and I decided to say, okay, like, fine, if Jesus rose from the dead, that's one thing. Um, if the Bible's not true, and if I can poke holes in the tradition, then I can still do whatever I want. Because Jesus might be raised from the dead, verified by however many external manuscripts. Um, but if I don't and can't trust history or the scriptures, then again, I'm off the hook. I can go back to eating, drinking, making merry because who says it's wrong? Um, and then, lo and behold, I was convinced that the Bible is true and that the Christian tradition is rock solid. And so, from that point, when I was probably about 20, is when my faith really began to become my own. And that journey was not just like a straight shot, there's lots of ups and downs. Um, but I think coming to as like an adult and needing to have not just these philosophical answers, but these like emotional embodied answers. And then having the courage and maybe enough of this foundation to explore that fully has allowed me to begin to translate some of those thoughts into an art, like into an art form, if you know what I mean. And so like my faith, um, like Jesus says he's come to heal the sick, that people who are healthy are in no need of a physician. And I just got to the point where if I want to find healing and if I want to find the truth, I had to be okay to go all the way. And I think a lot of people are okay to settle for answers or settle for what's in the club or settle for, like, so for example, and this isn't to throw the deconstruction folk under the bus. I love so many aspects of deconstructing your faith. But I think if people aren't careful, they end up in a new fundamentalism, right? There's like the conservative fundamentalism that says you must believe these things or you're out of the club. And you deconstruct because it's like accidentals and essentials. And you deconstruct from all the stuff that isn't essential to your faith. But if you're not careful, you just walk into a place that's giving you a new set of values that are like, if you don't believe in these values, you're out of our club. And I'm just not satisfied with sloganeering and clubs. I want to know what the faith actually means and what the faith is. Um, and so because I wasn't going to settle for any kind of fundamentalism, I just went on these wild, deep, lonely, hard, exposing journeys.
Mm. When you were telling that story, I was thinking, I resonate with that. I think that's why your art has resonated, why the things that you write resonate with so many of us, because we go,
Mm,
that's a bit of what I went through. I've felt like that. I've felt inside or outside at some point. For you, you said a couple times, I became convinced, right? And so I have this knowledge at a head level that like I needed to know something was solid and stand on it. And then I hear in and read in so many of your writings like a really beautiful love of wisdom, a philosophical approach to those truths. And that's what's interesting to me. There's an embodied side, and there's a very intellectual
yeah.
side and systematic side. And then there's this philosophical love of where did it come from? Like that weird cocktail of you. Can you go like, oh yeah, well, my mom's part philosopher, my dad's part theologian.
Yeah.
Canada did this. Like when you look at your story, I'm just interested because I think
Yeah.
many of us ask those questions, but we all approach it from our different vantage point. And you have kind of these three colliding trails that come or trails that
Yeah.
kind of lead into one. Where did that stuff come from?
I mean, so in different ways, probably from my family, but neither of them, my mom and my dad, not to throw any shade, they're not philosophers by any stretch of the imagination. Um, but both of them like really love life. So my mom is Spanish, like her heritage is Spanish and Russian, and my grandparents on her side, they fled Spain and Russia during a tumultuous time in the 19th century, and they're married in Peru. And so my mom is from Peru, but the heritage, but still like family and this earthy embodied connection of like laughter and touch. And so that's always been a big part of our family. My dad, his side of the family, like they had some really, really hard times, but they're all storytellers. And I think that's probably the baseline. The other thing is I just like fell in love with reading as a young kid, and I can't understate reading the right people. Like Lewis says, he's talking about atheists, how you can never be too careful of your reading when he first reads Chesterton. Um, and I was really fortunate to read like lots of myths, lots of folk tales growing up, and then I just got to read the right people. And so I think that for me, the threads were I kn- I know and knew that I whatever my truth was going to be, it had to bolster up the stuff that I love the most in life. And I don't, that's not like the selfish thing of like, oh, I'm addicted to my sin. And so whatever I believe has to bolster that up. I mean, like, if what I believe isn't going to make me laugh harder around a dinner table, if it's not going to make me find the like fire in my chest, courage to face things together, if it's not going to make me want to tell stories and hear stories and have good food and drink good drink and go for walks in nature and connect with people, then I'm like, this can't really be true. And then, like most people, I had an awakening. I read Lewis, I read Chesterton, I read Belloc, I read Tolkien, and I was like, oh, these are the guys. These are the people. And then I just consumed everything. And I thought, you know what? I can do all the things I want to the extreme. I can be the most like in Lewis language, the most northern kind of person. I can eat, I can drink, I can make merry, and our cheers is to the glory of God, right? And then I can be just as rational and just as sharp and just as philosophically minded as Lewis and Chesterton, but maybe I can be winsome. Maybe I
Hmm.
can be charming. Maybe I don't have to be a philosopher with all the hoity-toityness of academia and the white walls. Maybe I can still be fun. Maybe I can
Hmm.
make fun of myself. Maybe not everything needs to be so serious. And so I think I just had all these, I had like an example of like a real embodied spirituality and life from my parents. And then I think I just got the go ahead from my heroes. I just saw like these books became kinds of guides and mentors for me.
Hmm. It's that Christian humanism that you're describing of Lewis that just says like, and I love how he did this of like, it's not just a yes to life. There's like an otherness to what we're to aim at. And so there's a
Yeah.
recovery project of humanity. And when you really start to get your mind around that, that's the invitation that Jesus is making when he says, hey, life to the full. Like, I came to give you back something, to put back something that was completely like discarded, right? And abolished. These things that Lewis was wrestling with, was saying like full humanity is found in this new creation perspective that makes merry and has a deep rationality and a compassion that takes it to the end of itself. Like, there's nothing
Mm.
more beautiful than a fully charged, the glory of God, man, fully alive, this Irenaeus, like fire that just flies through the air. That's what I love about when I said, like, your art is able to take these ideas and translate them in a way that I think a fresh generation can engage and go, something about that resonates, right?
Yeah.
Artistically. Because it takes somebody. Who introduced you to Lewis and Chesterton? Like, who was the person that first put that book in front of you and said, you should read this? Or did you just find your way?
No, so my dad, first off, I agree with everything that you just said. I think that it is like the becoming a Christian is not a removing of something, it is a restoring and an addition, right? So used to live a life that said, like, my whole way of life was, okay, I become a Christian and now I don't do these things. And the things I do, I read my Bible, pray, and make sure I slam people over the head with Jesus. But I believe now that the work that God does in us is this kind of divine expansion. He's bringing us up out of ourselves, a little prison, to quote Lewis again, that we find ourselves in, and to show us, quote Chesterton, that like good things were made to run wild and free. Like that's what the rules in established order is to let us run free and wild in God's goodness. Um, and so I mean, my dad just read the Chronicles of Narnia to us when we were young, and I love them. I can't overstate how much I love them, even as a child. And then I think the first real, quote unquote, real, like non-narrative Lewis book I read was probably The Four Loves. And that just like clued me in, and then Mere Christianity. And those clued me into this kind of like, when you read them, you feel like you're having a conversation with someone who just never misses a beat, right? So it's so um like the beautiful thing about Lewis is he has nothing to prove. He doesn't use a big word when small words will do. He doesn't need to prove like how intelligent he is and all the myths he's read and all of his credentials. He just speaks to people to help them see and know. And he just opened my eyes and I thought, okay, I have to read everything this person wrote. And I did. I just read absolutely everything I could get my hands on. And then the same thing for Chesterton. I read The Everlasting Man before I read Orthodoxy. And The Everlasting Man, I think, is Chesterton's best book. It's amazing. And he helped me reinterpret essentially the entirety of human civilization and history, focused all on how Jesus is the fulfillment of everything. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, hey, these guys get it. Like, I could have a drink and I could have a smoke and I could have my heart set on fire and my mind sharpened with these people rather than, and this isn't to throw shade at church, I love church, but rather than just sitting in a Bible study and people saying what they're supposed to say. And no
Mm,
one leaves with their heart stirred. No one leaves with their mind sharpened. No one feels more embodied and connected with their neighbor. Everyone just feels like, hey, we did the thing we're supposed to do. How
mm,
come my life isn't changing?
mm, 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 mm. I love it. I'm reading Magician's Nephew with my son right now, and we got to
Yes.
the exploding guinea pigs part, and his mind just like blown. He's like, "What are we reading?" My wife and I were just in England. We were walking around Magdalen College in Addison's Walk, and we sat on a little bench there, looking out over the field that Lewis would have sat and imagined some of
Mm,
his stories. And I'm with you in the critique for the church, like a healthy critique that I think I'm a Gen X person, but like, I think a whole bunch of us are longing for a robustness. It's not that we don't want the Christian faith, it's that we actually want the Christian faith, right? And we're
Yes.
longing for people who embody their faith in a way like that, where they're not backing away from it. They're taking us further into it, right? And that's what excites me so much about our moment, because I don't think it's just church. I think what you're describing of, I did the thing, right? It's universities, it's business, it's art, it's Hollywood, it's everywhere you go. There's people just, we talk about it in terms of disenchantment. We're in a disenchanted world. There's just the meaningful whole has been so discarded that it doesn't, people, of course, they're sitting in church. Like, I just do the thing. And I kind of have gotten that way with CrossFit, and a bit that is in the States, like just our community for a short time, any community feels that way, but then it itself becomes, because we're looking at it, not through it. And I
Yeah.
think that's what your work is inviting us to do. So again, I could go all day, but I'm going to take us, like, I'm going to grab the wheel and like turn us hard right,
Yeah.
because I think this gets to it. When I went to Sword and Pencil, which this is the Patreon page. So if you're interested in this dialogue and conversation, just go to Josh's Patreon page. And you can be a part of an ongoing conversation where he gets to invite us to think and enter into this kind of dialogue. But when I went there, I noticed Dostoevsky's this beautiful quote, "Beauty will save the world." And right
Yeah.
away I was like, okay, why'd you put that right there? That says a whole volume about what you're about to enter into. But for you, why was that the quote that made it right beneath Everyday Saints?
Yeah. Yeah. So the big thing for me was, I mean, reading Dostoevsky will do something to you. And so I've read all of his big novels, the big five, and like Brothers Karamazov, for example, like all of my other favorite literary authors are like, if there's only one book that you're going to read, it's Brothers Karamazov. And all of us who are writing now are just trying to re-say in some small sense what Dostoevsky said there. And so, like Dostoevsky, if you are open and honest and can work through it, like they're hard work, but it'll do something to you. And he writes that beauty will save the world. And the first time I read it, I thought to myself, like, what does he mean? Beauty will save the world. Like the world is clearly broken and in need of saving. And even if I just let myself run quickly to the answer of, well, Jesus will save the world, right? Not think about it, but just run. I'd be like, well, if you're just, I could substitute Jesus for beauty. Jesus will save the world. Beauty will save the world. Is Jesus the most beautiful thing in the world? And then you just off to the races thinking. And so for me, getting confronted with beauty from Dostoevsky gave me the freedom to start considering, okay, I have all these other things I've studied philosophically, the transcendentals. Like, what if I could just reinterpret them the same way, like that the Neoplatonists did, and all the way through the Middle Ages, they reinterpreted all their Platonism and Aristotelianism through their Christianity. And coming to this idea of the transcendentals of goodness, truth, and beauty, and how God is the source of all goodness, God is the source of all truth, God is the source of all beauty, was like a deep revelation for me. But when I look at our modern time, I think that we have tried to save the world with truth. We've had these like these intellectual discussions, and they are helpful for some. Um, but for the most part, I don't think people are reasoned out of what they were never reasoned into. And so I was like, you know what? I can have all these reasoned, rational, intellectual, philosophically sound discussions, and my next door neighbor will not care that I can prove to him that the ontological argument for God's existence is perfect or it's great, or that whatever, that you shouldn't believe in a kind of absolute divine simplicity because it reduces God to blah, 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 blah. Nobody cares except the philosophers. And I found that goodness was the same, right? We had this big, quote unquote, emergent church movement where goodness became the top value at the expense of the others. And it just led to a very free love, zero expectation, all tolerance, no demands kind of spirituality. And I think that has wreaked havoc on the modern church personally. But then I was thinking, well, beauty has no real baggage like that. Because you can watch a movie, a film, you can read a book that's written by someone who doesn't hold the same faith as you, but the closer they get to beauty, the more the heart in the person is stirred up. And like courage is courage. All courage is God's courage, and it all finds its source in him. And so if someone portrays courage beautifully, it's going to draw you in. And it's way better for someone like, say you could like business plan how you're going to save the world and strategize, and you have a bunch of cowards and fearful people. It's way better to have them have some sort of atheistic courage than no courage at all, because even that courage will start to save the world. It will start to save them. And so when I think through beauty, I think like, hey, if I can give you eyes to see and ears to hear, and then like the courage to have hands and feet that will go in a direction to participate, and beauty will be the way to do that, then I think I can keep drawing you closer and closer to Jesus, where one day I can just do what Dostoevsky did to me. Jesus will save the world. Beauty will save the world. Like what you've been looking for the whole time is Jesus. And so my MO for the whole thing is like flipping it on its head. People are like, Josh, you don't preach the gospel enough. And I'm like, oh, I preach it with every single post. I just think God's a lot bigger than this narrow view of gospel you have. I think the cosmos is his. And I
Mm.
think he wins us over with sunsets and lakes and good beer and marital bliss and all kinds of things. Like God is always winning us over, drawing us to himself.
Mm. It's that it's sad when I hear that, like you don't preach the gospel enough. I think that right there says it all, right? That what's needed is even that really well-intentioned, like, Josh, get back to analysis, get back to talking about the ontological reality of God. Like, okay, that is just analysis, analysis, analysis over and over. But what you did there is like synthesis. Let's just move this one move over to take all that analytical stuff that's true. It is true.
Yeah.
But is it meaningful? And only when I'm able to see it from this lens that it's meaningful do I move toward it at all. And beauty is that thing that is, I think, that draws us towards meaning without us even knowing, right? It's the stronger spell that Lewis is saying, like it's going to pull us
Yes.
into something. So I think you're in good company when you rest. Thanks, by the way, for answering that in the way that you did, because when I saw Beauty Will Save the World, we always talk about, like, we felt our calling was to share the life and beauty of the gospel with the world. And when we
Mm-hmm.
set out with that statement, we had people say like, why complicate it? Your job is to share the gospel with the world. And we were like, no, it's very clear for us, right, that in order to be faithful to what we're called to do, that we need to talk about life and beauty. There's an embodied nature and it leads with beauty. And I think we're still trying to figure out what that means, right? But I think intuitively you're helping us go, yeah, like that's it. There's a deep why. And Solzhenitsyn wrestled in the same way with that quote. If you listen to his Nobel, or if you go read his Nobel speech, acceptance speech
Mm-hmm.
transcript, you'll come across him wrestling just like you did with Beauty Will Save the World. He said, at first, those were just mere words to me. And he said, how can how can beauty save the world? Had exactly the same tack and took the same line that you did to say, well, if beauty is a transcendental, classic transcendental, it's got these sisters of goodness and truth. And why is it that this one of those three would be singled out? And he says beauty is I think he said something that is able to pull truth into a force or something like that,
Mm.
like to lift it up. But he goes on in that speech to talk about that as a canopy. And that's what I heard you getting at, is that if you have three trees, right? And this is his words, but he basically said you have three trees. You have beauty, goodness, and truth. And the three of those are to form a canopy that is not a ceiling, but a canopy over us. If you have those three and two of them are chopped down, and you no longer have a good tree and a true tree, is it possible that a beauty tree can end up widening out to the point to kind of touch those others or begin to pull us in to let those others grow back? And I think that's, again, the way forward in our moment, right? And you, as you've started to tack in this direction, have there been moments where you have second guessed that? And as you've heard those critiques, as you've been like, uh, am I being faithful to not just my calling, but am I being faithful to the integrity of the gospel? Have you had those moments where you second guess it? Or has it been like, nope, burn the boats. I
Yeah.
just don't look back?
At the beginning, yeah, like, cause it wasn't like a one and done for me. And so like part of it, I'm writing a book, and part of the book is this section of like me starting to wrestle through leaving a system and a space and like an entire way of being, like a say a fundamentalism that says, and not heavy quotes there in case people are just listening, a kind of fundamentalism that says the only way to apprehend Jesus is to do so intellectually through the quote unquote again gospel. And that way of life like does answer a lot of your questions. It might not answer them well, but it can give enough for a person to get by. And so my deconstruction phase was to say like, well, what if, so for example, everyone knows drunkenness is wrong or infidelity is wrong, but we still get drunk. We still cheat. People know that pornography is wrong and they're still addicted. So knowing is not enough. I knew at some base level that it wasn't just my mind that needed to be captured by God's truth. I needed my heart. And like I know what that feels like when I first saw my wife. So like I think beauty is a prior reality. So beauty hits us first. When I first saw my wife, how we met, we were at a Christian concert. We had those like what do you call it? Like you go to an amusement park, there's a bunch of Christian bands and like youth groups will go, and we were at separate youth groups. I was a very mischievous kid, so I was with mine. I was shining a laser pointer in the lead singer's eyes. And she was at the back with a different youth group, and they were doing like a Christian mosh pit thing, and it was rainy back there, and they were on the grass. And I apparently got bored of making mischief, and so I went to the back and I picked up some mud, and I said, I'm gonna throw this at the prettiest girl I can see. And I did a spin, and that was Aislinn. I threw mud at her, and one thing led to another, and now we have a 1-year-old kid. Um, but like her beauty is what hit me first. I didn't intellectually send it be like, I wonder what her personality like is like, and I wonder what she thinks about capitalism and virtue ethics or whatever. I was just like, wow, this girl's really pretty. And as that went on, her beauty, and I use beauty with a capital B and all the stuff that fills in what beauty is for a woman, that's what elevated me to become a better person. Um, and I think that's what beauty does. Like beauty captures us first, and then beauty elevates it. And so for me, the journey was something like, can I have enough freedom and am I brave enough and courageous enough to say, no, you know what, I'm going to move out of a place that says intellectual facts are the ones that save you, and start to say, like, if I don't have my whole body consumed and propelled towards the good and the true, and I think beauty, like you said, is the propellant, it's what gives it its force, then how good and true are the things I'm actually believing? And so, like, getting married and having a kid, for example, those propel me to be that to be a better man because they're such beautiful realities that I now need to live up to. Um, yeah, and so it wasn't like a thing that I just fell into, but now that I'm convinced, I hear those things and I think to myself, I pray for people, be like, I want scales to fall from your eyes. I want you to taste and see that God is good. I want you to know that when you go for a walk and you hear the birds, that's actually God singing to you. I want you to know when you have like a good glass of whiskey and a good steak, that's God's gift, right? I was holding my son. I put him to sleep last night. And then I went to bed a couple hours later thinking, I'm laying down in the same loving embrace as of my father. Um, and I felt peace and I felt whole. And so, like, these things are like, if you don't have eyes to see them, it will pass you by. That's what Chesterton says, right? The world is not starved for lack of wonders with an S. It's starved for lack of wonder. We've lost the ability to see, and then we wonder why we don't experience. And so I
Mm,
see these people, this sounds so, and I'm not being condescending. This is just one beggar telling another beggar where there's the source. I just see people as blind. When
mm,
I hear that, I say, "Oh Lord, like how do they get on day to day?"
mm,
You can only beat yourself over the back with so many facts before eventually you do what I did and become an alcoholic and depressed and wanting out.
mm,
And then eventually you find some source of infinite beauty, like a fountainhead from which all beauty streams, and you say, I can drink from this all day, every day. Okay, fine,
mm,
great.
mm,
Life's
mm,
worth living now. Yeah, so it's a bit of both and. I like rejected the idea with every fiber of my being at first. Part of that was because I was blind, and then the other part was beauty demands everything, right?
mm.
Like if I want to be a man to live up to the beauty of my wife, there are a lot of hidden things, anger and resentment and apathy and just like laziness or selfishness that I continually need to die to. But the payoff is multiplication, right? You say no to greed, and you say no to selfishness, and you say yes to generosity, and the love is paid back 100-fold. And you just, like, what an exchange, what a currency. Like, God's economics are just unbelievable.
Your your description of that night, or I assume it's at night, where you're throwing mud at your wife, it's so
Yeah.
good, right? For to to be able to have the security and the freedom to say, and the honesty. I think that's what I opened with, of just saying I've come to know you as a friend, but as somebody who's really an honest and humble voice. The honesty to say it wasn't character traits, qualities, intellectual things. It was beauty. If I'm really honest, that's what made me move first. And if I walk into a room, that if I'm really honest and I say, why did I go to that corner, not that corner, right? My first calculation is not necessarily these presuppositions or ideas. We're not beings that move like that. And again, Lewis, imagination precedes reason. It doesn't supersede it. So we're not saying that these other good and truths are not the other legs of the stool. But I think that what you're hearing over and over from this podcast, what you're seeing and hearing from Josh's voice so powerfully and eloquently, is that beauty will save the world. There is something to pay attention to. Buechner said this, like
Mm.
the artist calls us to pay attention. And I think what you're calling us to pay attention to is that beauty is this first entry in to a wonderful, ever widening world. And you said it so powerfully, the risk, the danger. And this is for everybody listening. I'll just say it, like that when those scales fall and when you really begin to notice beauty and you say that is beautiful, and as Lewis with an objective waterfall, when you really are willing to say, I see beauty, I'm surrounded by beauty, it's everywhere, you're already on the trail that there's a
Mm.
maker, there's a designer, there is a limitless widening out, and you're going to come in personal contact at some point with the one who you're made by and for, who has made all of these things. And so it
Hmm.
does take courage, I think, to step toward beauty. I mean, it takes courage to throw mud at your wife, but to move
Yeah.
toward beauty does take courage. And you're probably listening to this, and well, I know you're resonating with the truth, the reality that beauty does call first. And you're probably sitting there going, I am being called to fill in the blank. And there's something beautiful that's calling me in that direction. I think the next move is courage, that there is a courage that's needed. Josh, I want to give you, we're going to put a comma, but that's the last thing I want to just invite you to say, because I think that's important right now for people to hear, like, okay, guys, I'm with you. I'm a yes,
Yeah.
but but that other thing is missing, or I've shrunk back. What do you say to that person who goes, I know it, but I don't want to take that next step?
Um, I'd say, I mean, I'm pretty frank. I would say something's gonna kill you, right? You're either going to be killed by the risk, and I'm gonna be honest, like changing your whole life to pursue beauty in the fullness is as risky as it gets because it does demand everything. But like I found in my own life, being too cowardly to take that step, I had to fill in all my loneliness and all my pain and all my grief and all my insufficiencies and incompleteness with stuff to numb that pain. And so I was just going to kill myself like death by a thousand cuts with alcohol and apathy and numbing myself with whatever pleasure. Or you could take the risk of letting beauty kill you. And when beauty kills you, when beauty drowns you, you find that you're more alive than you've ever been. But it hurts. Like it hurts like hell because it kills the hell in you. And so like you said, it is scary. Approaching a girl, I know what it's like being, you know what it's like being a guy. Approaching a girl the first time is scary. Imagine every part of your life being that scary and demanding so much more than you actually are. But the payoff, like finding the girl of your dreams, come on. And church is like that,
Mm,
right? You think of these old churches that apprehend you with beauty first and they invite you in. And if you have the courage to go in, then what's the rest of the stuff? You hear the goodness, you hear the truth, and it all starts coming together. And so I would say like if you're on the edge, just jump. You're gonna like it sounds morbid, but I mean this in the most life-giving way possible. You're going to die anyways. Like it's good to go through life with scars and it's good to go through life without any questions. Go to the bottom. I promise you, you would be if you go to the bottom of beauty and you don't find God, you'd be the only person in human history who has done that. And that's the challenge. The scary part is once you find God at the end, he's like, okay, now I have you.
mm,
And then that means you do everything I say. And he'll tell you to do crazy things. And you go through valleys of shadow of death. Zach, you know part of my story. And then you'll be like, fine, this is still worth it.
mm. That's so good. Crazy to think that everything will kill you, right? You are going to die.
Right?
So choose your own adventure. It's all going to lead to death. But one beauty has the power to raise you, the force to raise you back.
Come on.
And so choose wisely, right? So,
Ooh, I
Josh
got
Nadeau.
goosebumps, man.
Yeah. Josh Nadeau, artist, one of the most important, impactful artists of our moment, Sword and Pencil. You can find that work on Instagram. Go there. Everyday Saints, the Patreon page. I just encourage you, go and become a member, a supporter of that community, a participant in that community. Josh, we're putting a comma on it. We've got lots more exciting things. We're going to talk about the book in the future. We're doing some commission work. We'll talk about that. There's lots more ahead,
Yes.
but thanks so much for the time. Keep being well, and thanks for who you are.
Yeah, Zach, thank you so much. Honestly, such an honor, such a pleasure to be able to chat with you and hear from you. Um, I feel like it should be the other way around. You are a wellspring of knowledge and wisdom, and so thank you for indulging me and listening to some of my crazy rantings.
Let's go. More to come.